Cool. Hi, everybody. As Dylan and I were discussing, I'm going to start off with the official 2020 greeting. Hi, can everybody hear me? Can everybody see me? How's everybody doing today? Literally my first slide I have in my speaker notes to test the clicker, and my clicker has decided not to work. I charged it before I came away, and I'm pretty sure it like turned itself on in my bag, and so it's gone flat. So I'm going to go old school and use my keyboard for this. So thank you along to my session this morning. I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that this works, because not only am I currently presenting from Australian Internet, I'm currently presenting from mobile Australian Internet from an Airbnb in the Margaret River region in Western Australia. So fingers crossed this all works fine. So I hail from Perth in Western Australia, although I am on holiday at the moment, and I'm a little bit disappointed that I don't get to be in Sydney this year. I always enjoy my time in Sydney, particularly getting to explore more of the Botanic Gardens. I really love the Botanic Gardens in Sydney. A year ago, I got to be at NDC Sydney after a whirlwind year of speaking at conferences all over the world, and I look forward to hopefully getting to be there with you again next year in person. But today, I'm not here to talk to you about Australian Internet or my dog. Today, I'm here to talk to you about front-end testing. Now, we all know that testing is important. There's never really been a question. We even have a specific style of development that's named after writing tests, which is test-driven development. I'm just going to give it a second go at loading my speaker notes. Come on. If not, we're gonna just go a little bit old school for this. Yeah, okay. So we all know that testing is important, although there's been a lot of debate about whether or not you should be writing your code first or your tests first. There's never been a question about whether or not we should be writing tests. But the question that doesn't get asked, despite all of these strong opinions, is whether or not we're testing, or whether or not we should be testing, the front end of our applications. The front end important too. And the thing is, there are so many different kinds of tests that we should be running on the front end. We've got accessibility testing, performance testing, user testing, HTML validation, visual regression testing. It's often hard to work out what you need to test for and where you should be starting. So today I'm going to go through a few different options for front-end tests, and hopefully by the end of the session, you should have a bit of an idea about where you can get. Now I'm going to start off with something you may already be familiar with, which is linting. And although it's not technically part of testing, I do believe it is something that's really important and something that will help with testing down the track. So for those of you who aren't familiar with linting, linting is automated checking for programmatic and stylistic errors. It's a type of automated check that often happens early on in the development. It's usually something that you integrate with your IDE, and it checks for and sometimes fixes small stylistic errors to make. It's often used in teams to make sure that everybody's code looks the same and people aren't following different approaches. Today we're going to look at two specific testing tools. Now, depending on what programming language you use, there are a bunch of different tools that we can look at. Today we're going to be looking at ESLint, which is specifically for doing linting in JavaScript, and Stylelint, which is a testing tool for linting CSS, Sass, and similar style-based programming languages. Start off nice and easy. We're going to run npm install ESLint, and no, I'm not going to do that right now while running a remote presentation on Australian mobile data. I've done that already. I also apologize in advance. I have pre-recorded my demos because WebEx already fights enough for processing power in my computer. I wasn't going to also try and run 3 different local servers and so first off, now that we've installed ESLint, we're going to start off by creating a file in our project, which is the ESLint RC file, which is our config file, which allows us to specify different rules, different plugins, and things that we want ESLint to use. So inside of this file, we're going to export out 3 key sections. There's extends, which allows us to extend existing config. So this allows us to sort of start from a starter template rather than from scratch. We can also include plugins. This isn't something that I'm using today, but depending on what you're doing, you may want to use a plugin as well in your linting. And you can also specify rules. Now, rules allows you to either specify your own thing or we can override extends. So I'm going to start off by extending the Airbnb base config. Is a really great starter when you're not familiar with what you can do with ESLint. They've got a lot of really cool settings. What I've then also done is I'm going to go through and I'm going to set some other rules. Now, some of these may be for sections that Airbnb don't specify rules for, and others may be for things where I don't like the way Airbnb does it, and so I want to override them. Next, I'm going to go through and run ESLint in my command line. I've set up an npm script for that, and it has failed, which I expect it to do that because it's not going to pass straight away. There are issues with my code, but what it's actually done is that will then output any failure and error messages to a file inside of my test folder called ESLint.json, which if I have a look at that file, that's then given me a bunch of errors in my code, various things with mixed tabs and console log statements. And if I have a look at the first one, I can see here I have an issue with my ESLint RC file, which says that I have a rule that says I shouldn't have mixed tabs and spaces. And I do in fact have mixed tabs and spaces on line 27. If I go through and have a look at my file and go down line to line 27, I can see where that is and go through and fix that. So I can go through and do this for the rest of the errors when running ESLint. Now, there are a bunch, there are hundreds and hundreds of different rules that you can specify what you like with ESLint. You can find all of them on the website if you'd like to go through. Everybody has an opinion about JavaScript, even if that opinion is you shouldn't use JavaScript. So you'll be able to find plenty of rules for making sure that the code complies with the standards that you like to use. Next, we're going to use Stylelint to go through and do linting with the style files that I have. I'm going to create a Stylelint file, so it's .stylelint RC, which is their particular. And inside of that, I'm going to set that up. Similar to ESLint, we have extends and rules. We also have syntax for if you're using a particular type of style syntax. And you also have processes which allow you to specify additional plugins and different rules that you can use with it. In this case, I haven't extended anything. I've just gone through and set a bunch of rules for things that I like to check for in my styles. Now, this time, rather than running it in the command line, which I can do, I want to actually integrate this with my IDE. So I've got a VS Code extension for StyleLint. This is going to automatically check it. This is something I can also do with ESLint if I want. Now, if I go to one of my SAS files and add a bunch of my console bottom of VS Code, and this has now given me a bunch of errors. It says expected no more than one empty line. Because this is a particular rule that I have. If I remove them, that problem will go away. So StyleLint and ESLint, you can do them both of these ways, whether it's via the command line or through an extension in VS Code or your chosen IDE. Similar to ESLint, you can also find the list of all the StyleLint rules on their website, so you can go through and find options for what you want to do. Next, we want to move on to some more testing. So I'm going to start off with accessibility testing. Now, accessibility testing includes a few different things. It can be validating HTML, checking for alt tags so that your images have alternative text, making sure that you have sufficient color contrast, checking that your website works in screen reader or reader mode, and that it works with things like Google Home and voice assistants. So having accessible content and accessible website actually means that it's easier for people to use it with a Google Home or voice assistant as well. Now, today I'm going to use a tool called Pally. Pally is an open source tool. They've got a few different versions. I really like the command line version, but they have a few other things, including a dashboard and a CI tool, which is specifically built for integrating with CI pipelines. This is a really great tool, easy to get started, easy to use, and tests for a bunch of things. Now, Pally goes through and tests against the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or the WCAG guidelines. Now, the current guidelines are WCAG 2.1, which were published in 2018. You can find a list of these guidelines on the website. So these are guidelines that were put together by the World Wide Web Consortium, just double checking I've got my acronyms right, or W3C, and is an international community of people. Some are staff, some are public from the community who develop the web standards that we work with every day. So they've put together a bunch of guidelines on what it means and what we should be doing to make sure that our web content is accessible. Now, in those guidelines, there are 3 different levels that we can go through and meet. The first is A, minimum. This means that your content is mostly accessible, but it's not necessarily convenient for anybody with an impairment or a disability or using assistive technologies to use. The second is AA standard. This is a more general standard, has a good balance of ease of use and development. And if you're looking to make your website accessible, AA is probably what you're aiming for. Then, if you were able to guess, the highest standard is AAA. And this is usually used for, followed by companies who are making sure that their websites are accessible for people with disabilities. So we're going to go through today, and we're going to start it off nice and easy again, npm install Pally. Now, once that's installed, once that has installed, we're going to go through and create a new file inside of our folder. I'm going to call this pally.js, and I'm going to put this inside of my test folder to keep it close together. Now, Pally does work against all forms of applications, but the tests are written in JavaScript. I'm going to start off by writing a simple test, not too much config. And the first thing I have to do is require the Pally package, which I'm doing at the top here. And then I'm going to go through and create a function to run that test. Now this needs to be an async function so I can get the results back. And inside of that, I'm going to get the results through a promise. Inside of that, I'm going to run the Pally function. And for now, I'm just going to pass it through one thing, which is the URL of my web page that I'm testing against. So localhost port 8080. Once it gets those results back, I want to log them out to the console. And at the end of my file, I'm then going to run that function. So now that we've written a test, we can go through and run it. Now this is, because this is a JavaScript file, this is really easy. I can just go through and run this in the console. So I'm going to run a script that I have set up, which is npm run test Pally, but this is just running my JavaScript file with Node.js. And I can see this has now printed out my results. I can see the document title, so the title of my page, the page URL, and it's given me a nice long array of issues, which I can't read because JSON and objects are difficult in the console. So this is a little bit difficult for me to read. So I might want to make this a bit easier for me to look at. Just checking where we're at. Yeah. Okay, so to make this a bit easier to look at, I'm going to require the file system package, which is a package that's available for Node.js and allows us to write 2 files inside of our file system. The console, I want to save them to a file inside my project, and that way I can have a look at that. It'll be a bit easier to read. And that's then also something that I could log into my source control so I can keep track of it. So I'm going to use the file system package to write to a file called pally.json. I'm going to stringify the results I get back from Pally and log out any errors that I get if I get them. So rather than logging to the console, I want to write that to a file. Now I can go through and run my test again. And this time when I run, it should create a new file inside of my project, which I can see it has. Inside of the results folder, I now have a bunch of different issues with my application. So but now I can go through and have a look at some of those issues and what they actually mean. So this is one particular issue which we're getting here, which gives us a bunch of different information and error message information about where the element is and the particular guideline that it has issues with. If I get rid of a few items, there are 4 different sections that I want to look at. The first is the code. This tells me the guideline that it has issues with. The second is a message. This is the error message that it gets back. Third is the context. So this tells me which element it's found the issue with. And the fourth is the selector. So this allows me to find that particular element on the page. So if I go through and specifically have a look at just the context and the selector, I can see here there is an image. It has issues with the image. And the image selector is HTML body, main article, the first article, and the image inside of it. So if I go through and have a look in the source code of my application, I can see that it has issues with this image here. So this is the first image here that it has issues with. So I've found where it is in my application. The next thing that I want to do is work out what the issue is. And for that, we're going to have Now the code, if we have a look at the code, this is a nice long string letting us know exactly what guideline that the error has appeared against. And if we have a look, we just want to look at the last section of that, which is 1.1_1_1.h37. We can then go to this website, which includes all of the WCAG standards. We can take that number and we can find where that sits on the page. I would recommend doing Control F and copying it. Image element missing an alt attribute. Use the alt attribute to specify a short text alternative. On here, we can find even more information about the particular guideline, the particular reasoning behind why we're doing it, and how we can go through and fix it. But in this case, I can also get a bit of information from the, and so this lets me know that this element doesn't have an alternative text, for so you can, it will use Puppeteer as a headless browser to run the tests. You can get it to go through and do certain things on your application before it runs the test. For example, you can click on elements, you can wait for certain content to be visible, you can hover. You can specify certain viewports. So if you want to check something particularly on a mobile or a tablet screen size, you can specify the particular WCAG standard that you're testing against. So for example, you do want to be testing against AAA standard. You can also give it a few other bits of information. For example, if you're not just doing a standard GET request, if you need to send it through data, or if you need to set any custom headers or cookies, you can do that with Pally as well. So next we're going to go through and we're going to add a couple of extra options to our Pally test. And so we're going to go through and add a standard. So this time by default, it will test against AA standard. This time I want to test it against AAA standard. And I also want to save a screen capture. So when it will load it in the headless browser, it will then take a screenshot of the web page that it's looking at. So this can be really useful for going through and running accessibility tests, because the headless browser might be actually loading the web page differently to how we expect it to load. So once we've set this all up, we can go through and run our test again. And once this has run, this should have updated our Pally results file. So if I have a look in this file, I can see I now have even more issues because I'm testing against a much higher standard. So I have even more issues with my application that I need to fix, but I also have a screenshot that was taken so I can have a look at exactly what's going on in my application when Puppeteer is loading it and Pally is running the tests against it. Now, these screenshots can be really useful because sometimes the headless browser does do a few little funky things. Say, for example, if you have a look at this, something's not quite right. Things are getting a little bit funky, elements are out of place, and this is something that I wasn't seeing in my browser, but I was getting errors in my Pally tests. So taking these screenshots is really useful because I could have a look at this and go, whoa, okay, Puppeteer is seeing something very differently to what I am, and it will really help you to go through and debug that. Some of you may have also noticed that inside of my test, I'm actually using a promise.all, which allows us to set an array of promises that it will go through and test for. Now, I've done this because this then makes it really easy for me to go through and to string other tests along afterwards, and Pally will go through and run them all one after the other. So I can add another test in there, and it will go through and test different pages, or I can specify different options for it to test against. Now, if I go through and add some extra tests to my Pally file, I can specify a desktop version of my homepage, and then I can also change my original test to, rather than testing against the homepage, I can get it to test against just one of my post pages. So I can get it to go through and run a few different tests. So if I add the URL of one of the posts that I know, then the other two will test against the homepage. All of these are also testing against the AAA WCAG standard as well. And you can see here, this one is using the mobile viewport size. This one is using the desktop viewport size. Now, when I go through and run my test, this will go through and run tests on the 3 separate pages, one after another, and I should get all of those results out. Now, if I have a look inside of my results folder, we can see I have a bunch of different screenshots in here. So I can have screenshots of the mobile, screenshots of the home, and screenshots of the post. So I can see all of the different tests that have been run. And if I have a look inside of my pally.json file, I can see this will now have 3 different items in the array. And so this will have 3 different sections for the results. So I have one item for blog posts, this is for my mobile homepage, and then this is for my desktop homepage. So I can go through and see all of those results there in the one file. Moving on, next we're going to have a look at visual regression testing. Now, visual regression testing is a bit similar to a Git diff. It will take screenshots of an app and it will compare the old to the new, and it will give you then the difference between the two. Now, these kinds of things are really useful for when you're working with big code bases or there's a lot of people working on it, and you want to make sure that the code that you've changed hasn't inadvertently affected something else. Even if you're not working in a big team, I've found that visual regression testing is really useful for making sure that my changes aren't leaking out into somewhere else, because unfortunately past Amy and future Amy don't really communicate very well at times on what code happens. I've managed to change code somewhere which completely removed a sub-menu from another section of the website. So visual regression testing is really useful for doing that. Code bases, I'm going through and cleaning up a heap of new code. I can run visual regression tests, and I can then very easily go through and double check that the masses of code that I've just deleted haven't actually affected any other sections of the website, so they weren't actually being used anywhere. Now, to do this, I use a tool called Backstop.js. There are a bunch of different options out there. I chose to use this one because it was recommended by someone else. I thought the lemma looked really cool, and it was really easy to get started with. So now I install Backstop globally on my computer because that means it's really easy to get started with using it inside of my projects. Because Backstop has a really useful command, which is backstop init, which allows us to go through and rather than starting from scratch, it will give us a starter template to use. So I'm going to go through and run backstop init inside my project. And when I run that, I'm going to have a look here and I can see it's created a backstop data folder with JSON file, which includes all of the most of the information that I can set up for my tests, a few different scenarios, and a lot of different options so that I am ready to go and get started. Test their homepage again. So I'm just going to go through and replace that with my homepage so that I can then go through against that. So this is nice and easy to start with. You can wait a bit before doing anything. There are various different options and settings that you can set on each scenario that we can have a look at. So once we've set that all up, I'm going to go through and run the test. Depending on your hours, so we're going to go through and skip to the end. Once the test has run, it tells me that 0 tests have passed and 2 have failed, which doesn't look good, but this is actually what I expect to happen the first time I run the test. Now, what I can then do is I can have a look inside of my backstop data folder. I can have a look. It will have created a few folders, including HTML report folder and a bitmaps test folder. If I have a look inside of the HTML report folder, it has an index.html file, and if I open that up in my browser, we can have a look at the report that it's just generated from the test that it's run. Now, if I go through and have a look at this report, I can see here it says that the test has failed because the reference file was not found. So what Backstop does is it compares the test screenshot with the reference screenshot, but we don't actually have a reference screenshot yet because this is the first time we've run it. So that test has failed because there's nothing for it to compare against. What we can then do is we can go through and run a command backstop approve, which will then create the script, make the screenshots that we've just taken, will make them the reference screenshots. Now, if I go through and run the test again, pass the second time, because reference screenshots to take. So if I go through and run backstop approve, it will then copy the bitmaps test screenshots that it's just taken. It will copy them in to create them as my new reference screenshots. So if I load the screenshots here, this will become my new reference screenshot. Now, when I run the test again, when I run the test, now when I run the test, it will go through and run my scenario that I've set up while the test is running. Add additional items here if you want them. This is the ones that have been set up. So while the test is running, I think I might just skip. Once the test has run, it will then go through, now that we have reference screenshots, it should then go through and generate a report that will let me know that the tests have passed. So if I look here, I can see my reference screenshot and my test screenshot, and it lets me know that my tests have passed because these are both the same. So you can go through and have a look at them all here. Now, one of the issues with visual regression testing is it can sometimes yield false results. So visual regression testing tests whether My thing says it's got issues with network. Okay.
It's all right, you're back. You dropped that for a second.
Cool. So it can yield results even though something can be okay. For example, if images haven't quite loaded in, it may let you know that there's a difference, even though the difference is just whether or not images had loaded in one screenshot, but they hadn't in another. So it's really important with visual regression testing to actually go through and have a look. It will require you to go through and to do a bit of a sanity check, having a look over what is going on. Depending on what you're doing, you can also adjust, there's a particular section for mismatch threshold. So you can let it know of a particular percentage difference that it can have with still allowing the test to pass. Now, because this can be so picky, this visual regression testing may not quite be for you. In that case, that's where we can use end-to-end testing or UI testing. And for that, I use a tool called Cypress. Cypress is one of many options, so you may be familiar with Selenium, which is another tool. I mainly use it because it had been used in a project I was on already. If you haven't used testing tools before, it may be a little bit tricky to get your head around it. Similar to the other tools, we're going to start off by installing that. It's got issues with my network again. Am I all good?
Yep, you're good.
Can I get a
We see
thumbs
you.
up from
You're good.
someone if they can still see me?
We can see you. We can see you. Yes, we can see you. We can see you. We can see you.
Cool.
We can see you.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Yep. Okay, so we're going to start off by installing Cypress. Similar to Backstop, Cypress also has another really great command that we can run, which is Cypress open. The first time we run that, that will actually go through and again generate a bunch of Cypress open. This will go through and generate a bunch of starter Cypress files for me to use in my project. If I have a look, that has created a Cypress folder and a cypress.json file. We're mainly going to be working in the folder and particularly mainly going to be looking inside of the integration folder. There's also a plugins folder as well if you want to extend the Cypress functionality with a plugin. Inside of the integration folder, it's got a bunch of examples. So these are a bunch of tests that you can go through and get started with. Now, once this has gone through and started, runner has loaded, that is totally fine. Now, this is the Cypress task runner where we run a lot of the tests. We can see here all of the different example test files that it's already included in here inside the examples folder. In here, if we want, we can go through and click to run one of these tests. And this will then load it in the browser and it will go through and run the example test, which in this case, they're running against a sample Cypress website that they can use. So this is how we can go through and run the tests with Cypress. But let's go through and actually write some of our own tests. So as I said, if you're not familiar with the syntax, it may be a little bit confusing at first. It does get a little bit easier as you go through and write it. So this is what a Cypress test will often look like. If we break this up, the first thing we have, we describe the name of the test. This allows us to describe a human-friendly name where we can go through and write, let's say, for example, blog homepage. Naming things is hard. You're probably naming your test better than I am. We can then go through and specify before. This allows us to go through and specify something to run at the start of our test. Say, for example, actually visiting our web page. That's something we're probably going to want to do. We can then go through and write our test assertion. So in this case, we're asserting that our title should contain specific text. Now, Cypress bundles a few different things, including Mocha and Chai. So you may have used them before. There's a bunch of really great resources on assertions and examples of the different things that we can check for with Cypress on their website. Assertions is when we go through and set something like we expect name to not
We apologize for this, and we're back. Hello.
I'm really sorry, everybody. We're getting through it. If it helps, I will be providing the slides at the end, and these demos even have captions, so you can actually see my weird rambling if you're looking through these examples later on. I can also provide the video to the London version of this talk, which was not on Australian internet. So if you're really confused because you're losing half of this due to the remote presentation, there are a lot of really great example tutorials on the Cypress website as well for if you're wanting to get started. So we can also then go through and start writing some tests in my own application. So to do this, I'm going to go through inside of the Cypress folder, inside of the integration folder, I'm going to create a new file called test.js because naming things is hard. Now, we do write these inside of JavaScript files, but it will have a couple of issues. If you are using ESLint, because we've set that up previously, I recommend installing the Cypress plugin, otherwise it will throw a lot of errors at your Cypress files. So we're starting off by describing the test with a human-friendly name. So I'm going to call this test blog homepage because in this case we're testing the blog homepage. We're then going to go through and set a before action. So before it runs the test, I want Cypress to visit my blog page, which is localhost 8080. I then wanted to go through and so I'm going to start writing some tests. So the first one is that it contains my testing blog in the title. So I'm going to check the Cypress title. This is the meta title. It should contain the phrase my testing blog. So I'll specify that there. So that should be the meta title of the page that Cypress loads. I then want to go through and it should contain posts in the blog feed. So this should have a blog feed on it. To do that, I'm going to go Cypress get. Now it uses jQuery selectors. So these are nice and easy to find. So I'm going to get the element with a class of feed. And inside of that, I want to find an article element. So this is a HTML article element. So I want to double check that my feed contains at least one article. I then want to check that all my posts contain a title. So I want to get all the articles, and inside of those articles, I want to get a H2. So I want to make sure that each of them have a H2 inside of that, because that's what I'm using for the title. And then lastly, I want to double check that you can access the posts via the article title. So here I'm going to chain a few selectors together. So I'm going to get an article H2A. So I want to get the articles. Inside of the articles, I want to get the H2s. Inside of the H2s, I want to get the A. There's a link inside of that. This will give me a list of all of the elements on the page that match that selector. So I want to get the first one of them because I just want to test the first one, and then I want to click on that. So I want to click on that link and make sure that that takes me through to a post. So once I've gone through and done that, I can then go through and run my test in the test runner. So the file I've just created has now appeared in my test runner. If I click on it, it will go through and run my test. And so we can see on the side there that has gone through, and I've got a bunch of green ticks. I can then go through and hover over and click on each of these items and see what's going on here. So I can see it does contain my testing blog in the title. I click, it does contain posts in the feed. So there is the feed element and there are the articles inside of the feed element. I can check that all posts contain a title. So there's all the articles, and then inside of each of them, there is the H2. So that's all good as well. And I can check that I can access posts by article title. So article H2A, those are the links there. It's then going to get the first one, which is the one at the top, and then going to click on it. And when it clicks, it will go through to that first blog post. So that's then gone through to that next page, just as it should. So all of my tests have passed, which is pretty good. And I can then click through and have a look at that. So if something hasn't quite gone right, you can click through and have a look at that all in there. Now I can then also go through and run multiple tests with this as well. If I wanted, I can create a new test file to test it with, or I can actually go through and describe a different test further down in my existing file. So I'm going to do that today. So I'm going to go through and write some tests, this time for my mobile blog post template. So this is a bit similar to my other tests, but now at the start, when I'm defining my before action, as well as visiting one of the blog posts, I also want to set the viewport size. Now, when setting the viewport size, you can set width and height, or you can set a particular device size as well. So in this case, I want to test it against a Samsung S10. The list of all of the different devices and the different ways you can specify this are available on the Cypress website as well. Now, on this mobile blog post, I want to go through and check a couple of things. I want to double check that it has a visible post title. So I want to find the H1, and I'm asserting that that should be visible. So I want to make sure that that is visible. And I want to double check that I can navigate back to the home by clicking on the site title element. Now, when I go through and run my tests, this is going to go through and run my blog homepage test as well. Then I'm going to go through and run my mobile blog post template, and I can see one of these has failed. So if I have a look, I can see it does have a visible post title. That one has worked. It's been able to find that. So that's all good, but it's had issues when navigating back to the homepage. And I can see I have a weird sideways scrolling issue that I have to fix as well. So make sure you're actually looking at what's going on, because this may do weird things. But I can see it's tried to find an element with a class of site title, and it hasn't. So this is because my HTML has changed, so my test is no longer passing. If I have a look inside of my header file, I can see that the link that I'm expecting to have a class of site title doesn't actually have that class. So I can go through and add that to my element, save it, and then when I run the test again, so this time I'll go through again, run all of the homepage tests again, and they should all pass. I know I've got a visible post title, but this time it should be able to navigate back to the home page. So yeah, it's been able to find the element that has a class of site title, and when it clicks on it, it goes back to the home page. So my tests are all passing again. Cool. Excellent. So far today, ignoring all of the technical issues, we've managed to get linting set up, both JavaScript and style linting, which is cool. We've managed to set up and run accessibility testing, and we've had a look at what it's testing for and different options and how to fix them. We've set up visual regression testing, and we've also set up some end-to-end or UI testing. So that's pretty cool being able to do that all in an hour. Pretty successful talk, if I say so myself. Now, there are a lot of really great resources, so we can go back and have a look at this later. If you're looking at using Pally for accessibility testing, Jennifer Wadella did a really great talk at NDC London last year on using Pally and a lot more of the in-depth stuff. So you can check that out on YouTube. If you're wanting to find out a few more little bits and pieces about front-end testing, I wrote a blog post for 24 ways last year. It is Christmas themed, so it's almost relevant again. This goes through a heap of different testing tools and resources and explains a bit of the jargon and a few different points. I also wrote a blog post for JavaScript January earlier this year, which goes through a lot of the demos that we went through today, but in blog post form. I also have these slides available online, so you can find them online so that you can access them. And this will also include, as promised, the videos of the demos. And if you right click on the video, you can enable captions so you can see what I'm explaining as I'm going through each of the demos. If and when the video becomes available for this, that will be uploaded as well. That also includes links to all of the resources that I've gone through today. Thank you very much to everybody for joining in for my talk today. This has been a very interesting year for all of us with all of this remote presentations and remote presenting and remote conferences. So hopefully you all enjoyed my talk. Thank you very much for dealing with the technical difficulties that we had. For those of you who are not based in Australia, look, we already told you all about what the internet was like. We're not kidding when we say that, and hopefully we might be able to all see each other in person at some point in the not too distant future. So thank you very much for joining in my talk today, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.